Hi, everybody. I'm going to try to be the first to post a presentation, which gives me the chance to thank everybody, the participants for presenting their work in this format. I can't wait to hear the exciting work you've been doing, the discussants for your patience and attention, and to thank the audience, which at the moment is prospective, but thank you for clicking in. So the transformation I'm talking about here in this title is the main one that is of importance to us today. It is the one that went from an international political economy of compartmentalized, managed national economies that was put in place through various institutional arrangements in the post-war period. We know the story as a consequence of the devastating failures of international coordination of global capitalism in the 1930s, and toward a world of increasingly integrated markets, progressively encased away from democratic participation. In other words, the world we live in today. I'll mention Quinn Slobodian here since he'll be participating later in the conference, who told this story through the voices of a neoliberal collective that worked toward outcomes that reflected this change. What I'm proposing here is to broaden the list of actors and allies to one that includes the Soviet Union in the particular and meaningful ways I will detail to the extent that I can over the next 20 minutes or so. Now, much like Quinn's protagonist, the Soviets did not enact this change, but they provided important resources for that transformation. The Soviets were not caught in it. They did not fall victim to it. They did not stumble into it because of a failing system. This is usually how the story is told. They started borrowing money because they needed to feed the population or some such narrative. They actively helped create it. Another way of saying it is that they co-produced the means of their own domination by the dollar, and that they did this in order to liberate themselves from the Cold War pressures emanating from the US government. And this builds on previous work I've written that demonstrates the extent to which the Soviet Union, under several leaderships, tried to engage the capitalist world in trade and finance, and how it was hampered by Bretton Woods institutional arrangements. Here, I'm talking about capital and trade controls that Western states used to manage their reserves of US dollars as well as their post-war economic recovery. These arrangements were dedicated to harnessing US dollars, but they also gave the United States government an outsized influence over the kind of relationship a subordinated European polity could have with the socialist bloc. The American Cold War project reached its peak precisely during the existence of the Bretton Woods political economy that nurtured it. And it needs to be seen within that framework of structural power. Now, just to give a little bit more background and an example of what I mean by this structural power, if you'll bear with me, the Bretton Woods system's ultimate goal, the reason its main institutional measures of capital and trade controls and the dollar peg of $35 to an ounce of gold were put in place, was general currency convertibility. And in this light, the Bretton Woods system failed at first and didn't really come into its own until the end of 1958, when the major Western European currencies finally reached convertibility. Japan got there in 1962. What this meant was that European countries had built enough of a reserve of US dollars by the late 1950s that they could begin to do some short-term international lending and to increase the volume of that lending in the 1960s, which is also why you see a corresponding rise in international trade that decade. It is the reaching or the imminent reaching of this threshold that encourages many European states to finally reach out to the Soviet Union and negotiate trade arrangements based on at first 3-year terms, then on 5-year terms, that included this kind of low-level lending. Now, importantly, and I'll note this several times in this talk, this is usually depicted as Khrushchev breaking with Stalin's autarkic ways, but the evidence makes clear that this is not it at all. The motive power always remains in the West. This low-level lending, and this is an important point that I will contrast with later on, was still essentially a barter arrangement. Even if the values of that trade were expressed in convertible currency, the whole process until the late 1960s was aimed at very strict balancing of imports and exports on both sides. But still, at the beginning of the 1960s, Western European countries were poised to increase their trade quite meaningfully with the Eastern Bloc as a consequence of recently established convertibility. So Germany could be forgiven for thinking in 1962 that they were now in a position to do a major deal of gas for pipes with the Soviet Union, which they went ahead and did that year. They signed the contracts with the Soviets and both sides were ready to go. And then the American oil majors went to Washington, complained about it, and the United States vetoed those deals. The Germans were forced to break those contracts, and the Soviets spent the next half decade reminding the Germans about how unreliable they were as trade partners. And they were right. So the American state under Bretton Woods still had that kind of structural power. They would use it consistently to ostracize the Soviets and the whole of the socialist bloc, including China, from world trade and world finance. This is the structural power that the Soviets set out to break at the end of the 1960s, and this is the story of how they did so. This interruption begins only a couple of years later, and it begins in London, in the city. Now, economic historians in the 1970s had a bit of a debate, small and unimportant, but telling, about which large project of technological transfer was the game changer in East-West relations. And most agreed on the famous Fiat deal of 1966, in which Fiat built for the Soviets a car factory in Togliatti. This was certainly one of the largest East-West deals ever made, and it was justly famous for that. But several decades ago, economist Philip Hansen proposed another one. He proposed a smaller turnkey deal with the British in 1964 for a polyester plant bound for Mogilev in Belarus. Hansen's argument had to do with the amount of man-months of personal contact that Eastern and Western experts had with each other and the quality of the institutional cooperation between East and West. That's what he thought made the exchange pioneering. But the Soviets did not see it this way. Many years before Hansen made his argument, in the late 1970s, is when Hansen made his argument, they had already agreed with him on the trailblazing quality of the Mogilev polyester plant. But for reasons altogether different. For them, it was a question of financial possibility and Western readiness. They argued this in a report in 1964. And what they argued was that the trail being blazed here was financial. If you let me quote from this report, I'm sorry for the dry language. I have to, this is the bread and butter of what I do, unfortunately. Let me quote, quote, "For the first time in the history of our foreign economic relations with capitalist countries, we obtained long-term bank loans for important amounts. At the same time, we received these loans on more favorable terms than ever before in the entire history of credit relations between the Soviet Union and England," end quote. Now, this was not an aim in itself, but merely a step closer to the global market integration of Soviet desires. Let me quote again from that same report. "The procurement of long-term bank loans in England in 1964 greatly facilitated the possibility of obtaining such loans in other capitalist countries, which significantly improved the competitive position of Soviet foreign trade organizations in the most profitable placement of orders on terms of long-term financial credit, making it possible, and this is important, to organize competition between firms from different capitalist countries." This is at a moment when, and that's the end of the quote, this is at a moment when they failed time and again to convince Western states to liberalize Bretton Woods institutions of trade regulation. They were constantly appealing to them to liberalize the goods that they imported from the socialist countries. They would call up the IMF, who agreed with them, et cetera, et cetera. And so they wagered on finance as the agent of international market integration. And that wager was first placed in London. The British here were directly contravening American direction. And the Americans complained bitterly that year about this transaction. British intransigence was not just against the discipline of the American Cold War project, which it certainly was, but as the Soviet report explained, it was also a contravention of the Berne Union, which, like other institutions of the 1930s, had helped govern international commercial credit. The Berne Union, Berne here as in the city in Switzerland, was launched in 1934, and one of its main functions was to forestall market competition among trade export lenders by establishing limits on the duration of credit to 3 years, which in the late 1950s was lengthened to 5 years. And it was meant to prevent export subsidies and a possible competitive dynamic that might once again create international tension. This was exactly what the mixture of trade subsidies and tariffs had done during the Great Depression. Like so many of the institutions arising from the 1930s, the Berne Union was to provide information, a forum for discussion, and ultimately coordination. So the undermining of the Berne Union was ultimately a triumph of the city and the bankers of the city, which had long been a fan of the Soviet Union's creditworthiness and had maintained a cozy relationship with the communists even at the height of the Cold War. This is something the Soviets will do time and again. That is, time and again, they worked to disassemble the institutional arrangements of international state coordination set up in the aftermath of the 1930s. Just as the Soviet Union goaded the British into undermining established practices of coordination in the governance of international finance, so would they then turn the next year and help Italy's ENI, the main Italian energy conglomerate, erode the coordinated power of the Anglo-Saxon energy oligopoly, the Seven Sisters, the Seven Majors, who sort of famously created an energy environment within which Bretton Woods could thrive. And here I enter into the second main element of the argument I have been constructing over the last few years. From 1964, the British became more willing to lend more and for a longer time. This was nice, but the vehicle the Soviets would ultimately use to help break down the Cold War ostracism of their material relationships was not the occasional bout of British intransigence, but rather the energy and vast infrastructural building it required. That story starts in Italy. The Italians had had a longer relationship of trade with the Soviets in the post-war than almost anybody. ENI's head Enrico Mattei had famously sought to bypass the transnational monopoly power of the Seven Sisters by cutting oil deals with the Soviets and with others, the Libyans, etc. And in June 1965, just a week before Fiat came knocking in Moscow for its deal, ENI came to Moscow with an ambitious fight for gas deal. Not Enrico Mattei, who had died under mysterious circumstances in 1962, but the head of ENI. The Soviets took a little time to think about this proposal from ENI, and then they came back and upped the ante. The two partners came to envision this deal quite differently. ENI had in mind an already enormous project that would strain its financial and productive capacity to the limit. It wanted to bring gas in from Ukraine and through Hungary and Yugoslavia. The Soviets countered with an altogether different beast. They would use this opportunity to get the Italians to fund the connection of the West Siberian gas fields to the gas pipe networks of European Russia and Eastern Europe. But importantly, what this vastly more ambitious infrastructural project was meant to do was to massively increase the loans and the times of repayments the infrastructure required. As negotiations ground on, it became apparent that ENI would not deliver the kind of generous long-term loan the Soviets were hoping for in order to transact this deal. And this is when the Austrians cut in and successfully negotiated this deal. The details of that negotiation are very interesting, but I don't have time to get into them. Though the Austrians were the first to strike an energy deal, they were ultimately a gateway to Germany, which in fact was already involved in the Austrian deal through arrangements that the Austrian gas company had worked out with Mannesmann and Thyssen to deliver German pipes the Austrians themselves could not produce. Germany was interested in bringing in Soviet gas in order to build a market that might offset the Dutch monopoly of gas that Exxon and Shell exercised in Germany through their partnership with the Dutch. This would be Dutch gas. Again, I won't be able to get into the fascinating details of these negotiations, which have to do with how they were organized around a common language of the market and market principles in the absence of a market. But the main point is that it was West Germany, in collaboration with Austria, Italy, and eventually France, that finally gave the Soviets what they wanted. And what they wanted, they made very clear in these negotiations. While the Germans were focused on the price of gas, which was key to their effort at disrupting foreign monopoly power in West Germany, the Soviets spent their time asking for bigger credit volumes and longer repayment periods through different schemes. Now, the reason gas for pipe deals were so helpful in this Soviet objective was that the Soviets would not begin to pay back the loan for the pipeline until gas started flowing back to West Germany. That meant was that the 5 or so years standard repayment could be stretched to 10 years and more to account for the pipeline construction. These terms and volumes would later be stretched even further as East-West infrastructural projects proliferated through the 1970s, along with their debt-making capacity, right? The more of these projects were in place, the more money was created out of nothing. Now, the fact that Soviets signed a project with the Austrians years before the Germans signed on, even though the Austrians, like the Italians, could not ultimately underwrite the project, lays bare what the project was at its core. It was speculative. In every sense of the word, it was speculative. It sought to materialize in energy, steel, and machinery the kind of financial relationship the Soviets had long sought to have with the West. The pipe would produce and reproduce an endless relationship to time that would have the potential to put an end to the barter-like trade account balances of the Bretton Woods era. This is the contrast I was talking about earlier at the beginning of this talk. The creation of debt etched in the durability of an immutable infrastructure and energy dependence would finally allow the relationship to acquire a temporal quality it had so far lacked. Barter had always been a relationship delimited by the time required to produce it. It is discontinuous by nature, with no reproductive mechanism other than an always precarious socio-political will to continue it, which makes barter, of course, a favorite practice of, for example, strangers or distant relations who prefer to keep that relationship that way and maintain a certain amount of autonomy. And barter, in other words, was often a way to avoid relations of mutuality, trust, and responsibility. In this adverse context of Bretton Woods and the Cold War that Bretton Woods made possible, the Soviets had developed list-based trade commitments to diminish barter's ever-existing possibility of disconnection. What would cement that ongoing debt-based relationship was not diplomatic goodwill or geopolitical calculations. This is usually how this trade is presented. It's, you know, an outcome of detente. I'm not saying that detente is an outcome of this trade. I'm saying that, that this trade is an outcome of the new arrangements of finance that the Soviet Union was able to produce in collaboration with Western financiers. So this ongoing debt relationship is an outcome of the capitalization, the language, logic, and practice of which was as commonplace in the West as it was in the East. West Germany, in collaboration with Austria, Italy, and eventually France, collaborated with the Soviets in constructing these, the infrastructural technology that would instantiate the relationship to time and debt the Soviets had sought for so long. The goal that, to remind you, they had first celebrated in London in 1964. So years before the famous recycling of petrodollars from the Middle East, the Soviet Union had opened the gates to capital on the back of an energy and financial relationship that could no longer be sabotaged by the United States. New alliances were forged, and a new architecture for global material exchange began to materialize around the agency of these newly empowered historical actors. And here, let me gesture toward Timothy Mitchell's argument in his book Carbon Democracy about the way oil and gas obviated the power of coal miners and labor unions to generate general strikes. Importantly, the Soviets more often than not undermined the strikes in the West through increased deliveries of oil or coal or whatever was needed whenever any of their West European partners were under pressure from workers. The concentration of oil and gas allowed in decision-making over the economic life of Europe had the effect of bringing a new set of actors to the fore. Above all, bankers that awarded the Soviets, as if by magic, ever greater amounts of allocative power, in other words, money, that only compounded on itself, increasing the voice of a repressive regime over European economic life almost to the same extent as it was increasingly negating that of European citizens. The pipeline network, the pipeline system the Soviets built over time was the largest and costliest project that the socialist world ever undertook. And it was in effect a pan-European project requiring a vast assembly of business, banking, political, and social interests throughout Europe. To bring it about, the Soviets demanded a breach to the prudential measures of the US and the UK had put in place in Bretton Woods, those trade and capital controls we spoke about earlier. Through all the negotiations I examined, the Soviets fought to deepen Western capital commitments to the communist bloc by pushing for longer and larger credit arrangements. They patronized and fortified their reemergence of finance as a control center for global economic life, a position that would slowly render financiers with ever greater political control over the allocation of capital, the mechanisms and technologies through which it would be accumulated, like these infrastructural projects they collaborated with the Eastern Bloc on, and ultimately the logics and values through which that accumulation would take place. The financialization process in the West, in other words, had a powerful and reliable accomplice in the East. Thank you for your time and for listening.